Hello travelers. It's been a long day for you already. You can now rest here. Listen to funny histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why you wouldn't last a day in the Great Depression and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. The year is 1932. You wake up on a thin, lumpy mattress stuffed with yesterday's newspaper, because feathers are a luxury and comfort is for people with stocks. Your bedroom is also your living room, your kitchen, and if you're lucky, shared with only 5 relatives instead of 12. Outside, dust is piling up like nature is trying to bury the entire town in shame, and you're just grateful the roof hasn't caved in yet. Congratulations, you've survived the night. Now you only need to get through the next 24 hours of starvation, joblessness, despair, and social collapse. Easy, right? Spoiler alert, you wouldn't last a day. You open your eyes, groggy and cold, because insulation is something your house used to have before you sold the walls for firewood. Breakfast is on the table, a generous helping of stale bread. No butter, no jam, just the faint aroma of hope and economic ruin. Coffee? Not unless you count hot water with a bean waved over it like a magic trick. And cereal? Sure, if you mean a single cornflake and an inspiring quote from President Hoover. You slap on your best clothes, which is to say, the same outfit you wore yesterday and the day before, and probably the day you were born. It's patched up with more mismatched fabric than a quilt made by Picasso. You hit the street in search of a job, so do about 15 million other people. The competition is stiff, mostly because everyone is starving and has nothing to lose. Your resume includes willing to work and won't cry too much if yelled at. But employers aren't hiring, they're folding. You line up for hours at the factory gates, only to be told they closed last week and now serve as a shelter for unemployed rats. Not metaphorical rats, literal ones. They have tiny signs that say, "No vacancy." Maybe you'll try selling apples on the street corner. Everyone's doing it. Apple salesmen are the influencers of 1932. The problem? Everyone else is broke too. So you're basically trading apples for eye contact. By noon, your stomach is staging a coup. You consider a soup kitchen. There's a line around the block, but that's better than dumpster diving, which you tried last week and ended up fighting a raccoon for a banana peel. The raccoon won. At the soup kitchen, you get something warm, vaguely liquid, and questionably nutritious. Is it soup? Is it regret? Hard to tell. But it's food, and that makes it a 5-star meal by depression standards. Back home, your parents are pretending to be calm while mentally calculating which heirlooms can be pawned tomorrow. Your little brother is practicing how to smile with empty pockets, and grandma is telling stories of when bread had crust and softness. You all gather around the radio to hear Roosevelt's voice, hoping it comes with a miracle. Spoiler, it doesn't. There's talk of moving west. California has jobs, they say. Or at least oranges, but the journey is long, your car is broken, and so you just stare westward like it's the promised land, which to be fair, it is. Unless you're in Oklahoma, then it's just dust. As night falls, you lie in bed, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the wall. There's no Netflix, no TikTok, not even a board game unless someone remembered to carve Monopoly into the floorboards. You try to sleep, but the hunger, the anxiety, and the guy on the corner practicing saxophone for nickels keep you up. He only knows one note. It's a sad note. And there it is. One whole day. Still think you'd survive. You came into this century with soft hands and a smartphone. You'd fold faster than a flophouse cot. The Great Depression wasn't just a bad time. It was a slow, painful masterclass in suffering, resilience, and surviving, when life gave you nothing but lint and lemonade dreams. So the next time your phone dies or your coffee order's wrong, remember, once upon a time, breakfast was wishful thinking, jobs were fiction, and hope came in a can labeled government cheese. Let's say you've decided to leave. You pack everything you own, which frankly fits inside a suitcase that smells like attic and regret. You're headed west, where rumor says there's work-picking fruit, and where the air might actually contain oxygen instead of powdered earth. Congratulations, you're now an official Dust Bowl refugee, or, as people affectionately called you back then, a Okie. Even if you weren't from Oklahoma, labels weren't picky in the 1930s, just judgmental. You load up into your family's busted Ford Model A. It's held together with string, prayer, and the distant memory of better times. It coughs like a chain smoker and drinks oil like it's morning coffee. You hit Route 66, the so-called Mother Road, except she's not in a nurturing mood. Potholes? Check. Breakdowns? Constant. Bathrooms? Somewhere between good luck and tree. Gas costs a few cents, but that's still more than you've got. So your dad rigs up a homemade fuel cocktail made of kerosene, boot polish, and unfiltered hope. Shockingly, the car still moves. Miracles happen. You stop at every small town looking for work. Each time you're met with the same three things: a no jobs sign, a sheriff who stares like you're already guilty, and a half-eaten sandwich you strongly consider stealing. You sleep in the car most nights, cramped between your siblings, all of whom are developing distinct flavors of body odor. The smell? Somewhere between desperation and a wet burlap sack. If you're lucky, someone along the road offers a day's work, maybe picking peaches or stacking crates. You get 10 cents for 12 hours, and you go home with hands that look like you tried to high-five a lawnmower. The worst part? You're actually one of the lucky ones. Most people don't make it to California, and even if you do, it's not the land of milk and honey. It's more like the land of oranges and overcrowded labor camps where getting paid is a maybe and getting scammed is a guarantee. Let's say you're not a dusty traveler. You're in the city. Maybe Chicago. Maybe New York. Maybe somewhere in between that has both concrete and despair. Urban life in the Great Depression was like living inside a history textbook and realizing that every chapter ends in eviction. You share a cold water flat with 6 other families. There's one toilet, and it's haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the things you've seen come out of it. Your rent's overdue by 3 months, but the landlord's overdue by 5, so no one says anything. It's an unspoken agreement, like a staring contest of poverty. You try to keep up appearances. Maybe you shine shoes, sell newspapers, or carry luggage at the train station. You earn a few pennies, which you immediately trade for beans, a crust of bread, and something called meat product that technically used to moo. And then there's the fashion. Everyone's clothes are hanging on for dear life. Your socks are made of recycled curtains. Your shoes have holes big enough to qualify as windows. Style tip: depression chic is all about looking like you're about to rob yourself. Public parks become social clubs for the broke. You see men in worn suits playing checkers with bottle caps and talking like they still run businesses, which they did 2 economic collapses ago. The public library is your only source of heat and knowledge. You read books not to learn, but to distract your brain from gnawing its way out of your skull from hunger, and God help you if you get sick. Hospitals cost money, so you stay home, wrap yourself in a wet towel, and hope the fever decides you're not worth the effort. Let's talk about children. You think being a kid in the 2000s was rough, because your Tamagotchi died. Try growing up in the 1930s, where your idea of playtime was throwing rocks at a can, and hoping the can didn't throw back. Your school is a one-room building shared by kids of all ages, and one very tired teacher who's being paid in IOUs and leftover soup. Desks are hand-me-downs from the Spanish-American War. Books are so outdated they still refer to future technologies like the steam engine. Most days, though, school's optional, because survival isn't. Kids worked, not helped, worked, shining shoes, selling newspapers, collecting scrap metal, or, if you were in really deep, climbing into machinery your body should not be near. No toys. You get a stick, a rock, and your imagination. And no, the stick is not for pretend. It's your primary defense against angry geese, shady hobos, and occasionally your little brother. Dinner, not a guarantee. You learn to stretch one potato into a family meal. Boil it, mash it, slice it thin, and call it chips. Season it with, well, nothing. Salt is a weekend treat, but you adapt, because kids do. They make fun out of misery. They laugh in between hunger pains, and they know one truth better than adults. Nothing stays the same forever, not even this. Now let's say you're not the honest type, or rather, the depression has slowly eroded your moral compass, until stealing from a rich man feels more like recycling. You've entered the realm of depression-era crime, and business is booming. Bank robbers are the rock stars of the era. Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd. They're the influencers of the criminal underworld, armed, dangerous, and with better suits than anyone who's employed. People don't just fear them, they admire them. Because when the banks take your house, and someone takes money from the bank, that's basically justice with a shotgun. Petty crime is rampant. People steal bread, shoes, and coats right off sleeping bodies, not for profit, for warmth, for survival. You might run cons, selling miracle tonics made of vinegar and boot polish, or fake stock in companies that haven't existed since the Hoover administration. And then there's the black market, booze, rationed goods, and under-the-table jobs that pay just enough to keep your conscience quiet. You survive how you can, and if the law catches up with you, jail's not that scary. They feed you there. Let's dig into how the New Deal and other government programs reshaped daily life during the Great Depression. Government help arrives. The New Deal, and slightly less doom. At this point, you've tried everything. Walking west with a bag of potatoes, eating boiled leather again, and selling your last pair of socks, which were technically just foot-shaped holes. You're one step away from befriending a raccoon and starting a foraging cult, when suddenly, help arrives. Kind of. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the only man in America whose smile alone made people believe that maybe, just maybe, things might stop sucking quite so much. When Roosevelt took office in 1933, the country was in a full-on nosedive. Banks had collapsed, jobs were imaginary, and the stock market was lying on the floor, muttering something about needing a minute. FDR looked around and said, "Cool, we're gonna fix this," and rolled out the New Deal, a suite of programs designed to put Americans back to work, restore dignity, and possibly confuse future generations with an alphabet soup of acronyms. Let's break down what this all meant for your average Depression-era human being, aka you. First up, the CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps. If you were a young, jobless man with a strong back and no known allergies to dirt, you could sign up to plant trees, build trails, and generally wrestle the wilderness into something more picnic-friendly. In exchange, you got $30 a month, $25 of which was sent home to your family, while you got to keep the rest for luxuries like toothpaste, canned meat, and possibly a harmonica. Then there was the WPA, or Works Progress Administration. This was the government's way of saying, you like sidewalks? How about thousands of miles of them? The WPA gave jobs to millions building roads, bridges, schools, airports, and public buildings. If it stood still, they probably paved it. One guy even got paid to write travel guides to every state, proving once and for all that even government-sponsored procrastination can be productive. Not the hard hat type? No worries. Enter the Federal Writers Project, which paid unemployed authors to collect folk tales, slave narratives, and strange local superstitions, essentially turning America's grandmas into best-selling ghost story contributors. Meanwhile, artists and actors were commissioned to paint murals, perform plays, and teach people how to read. That's right. The government literally paid people to be creative. Somewhere a modern starving artist just fainted. If you were a farmer and still had anything resembling a field, the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Administration, paid you to not grow crops. Yes, really. Because overproduction was driving prices into the floor, the government said, how about we give you money to chill out for a minute? Imagine that today, we see you're doing too much. Take a nap. Here's $40. And then there was Social Security. Signed into law in 1935, it was designed to give elderly folks a bit of cash to survive on once they hit a certain age. So if your grandpa stopped chopping firewood, now he might actually get to retire instead of just collapsing quietly behind the barn. These programs didn't fix everything. Millions still struggled, but for the first time in a long time, people felt like the government was at least trying. Public morale began to inch upward from doomed forever to mildly skeptical, and for some, those New Deal jobs meant food on the table, shoes on their kids' feet, and dignity that hadn't been seen since 1929. But let's be clear, it wasn't all sunshine and alphabet agencies. Some of these programs excluded women and minorities or gave them the worst jobs for the lowest pay. There were mountains of red tape, corruption, and a whole lot of we're figuring it out as we go energy. But compared to the nothingness that preceded it, the New Deal was like tossing a life raft into a sea of starving swimmers. Still want to keep your Depression-era street cred? Then brace yourself, because even with all that government support, people still needed an escape hatch for their minds, something to make them forget. For just a moment, that dinner was once again a can of corn shared by 5. Let's escape the gloom for a moment, and talk about how people tried to forget they were living in a giant national dumpster fire. Welcome to the world of cultural life and escapism, where even in the darkest hour, humans still craved laughter, music, and a good distraction from the fact that their shoes were made of newspaper. So, you're exhausted. Your hands are blistered from WPA shovel work. Your dinner was 3 lima beans and a prayer. And your mattress is so lumpy it's been nicknamed Mount Regret. What do? You turn on the radio. In the 1930s, radio was king, the hearth of the modern American home, the internet of its time, but with significantly fewer cat videos and conspiracy theorists. Almost every household had one, even if the house itself was little more than a glorified box with holes. Entire families huddled around the glowing dial like pilgrims before a sacred fire, ears tuned to every word that crackled out of the speakers. There was drama, there was music, there were cowboys and comedians and cliffhangers that ended just before the good part. So you'd tune in next week. One minute you were a broke farmhand trying to boil dandelions, and the next you were flying through space on Buck Rogers, solving crimes with the Shadow, or laughing so hard at Amos and Andy that you forgot the rent was 2 months late. And then there was FDR's fireside chats. The president himself would come on the airwaves and speak directly to you. Yes, you. In a warm, confident voice, he explained complicated policies like banking reform and relief aid in plain English. So even your grandma, who only spoke grumble, could understand. It made Americans feel seen, comforted, and just a little less like everything was spinning into oblivion. But if radio was the beating heart, Hollywood was the escapist fantasy that made your dirty, threadbare life feel like someone else's problem for a while. Even in the worst years of the Depression, people scraped together their nickels to catch a movie. Some theaters ran promotions, a free dish with every ticket, double features or bank night raffles where you could win money just by showing up and sitting still. Compared to starvation, it was a pretty sweet deal. You sat in the dark as Shirley Temple tap danced her way across the screen, grinning like she had never even heard of poverty. You watched Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers glide across polished floors in clothes so fancy they might as well have been dipped in dreams. You escaped into tales of gangsters, romantic screwball comedies, and dramatic courtroom showdowns where someone always shouted, "Objection," at just the right moment. And let's not forget music, jazz and swing-filled dance halls with life. If you could still afford a dime for a soda, and your knees hadn't yet given up from malnutrition, you could jitterbug your worries into a temporary coma. Radios pumped out the voices of Billie Holiday, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, songs of heartbreak, hope, and why is there a banjo in this, transported people far beyond the reach of dust storms and soup lines. Even board games and comic books rose to prominence. In 1935, Monopoly was released, letting families play the fantasy of owning property and making money, something that now seemed about as real as Bigfoot riding a unicorn. Superman would arrive a few years later, a caped immigrant with a strong jaw and a moral compass, punching through despair with the power of pure optimism. It wasn't just entertainment, it was emotional survival. Culture gave people a way to process grief, to hold on to joy, to whisper to themselves, "We're still here, we're still laughing, we're still dreaming." Because no matter how bad the breadlines got, Americans refused to give up their right to a good story, a dance, or a melody. Of course, some didn't need any help imagining a different world. They just made one up. Religious revivals, fringe cults, and self-proclaimed prophets bloomed like wildflowers in the economic wasteland. People wanted meaning, something to believe in besides Wall Street roulette. And if that meant joining a guy who claimed he could summon angels with a spoon, well, at least it wasn't another shift at the canning factory. And when all else failed, people laughed. Gallows humor flourished. Cartoons in the paper poked fun at their own misery. One popular quip from the era: "We thought we hit rock bottom, and then someone handed us a shovel." Let's say you've lost your job, your savings, and your last chicken ran off with a traveling harmonica player. What's left? That brilliant brain of yours, and a willingness to do anything legal, semi-legal, or well, it's only a crime if you get caught. Welcome to the glorious world of Depression-era hustles, equal parts ingenuity, madness, and the desperate art of looking like you meant to do that. First up, apple sellers. Sounds wholesome, right? You picture a guy with a mustache and a smile, offering crisp fruit to passing strangers. But during the Depression, this was often code for, "I have no job, no prospects, but I found a crate of apples, and I'm standing here until someone gives me money." Cities were flooded with apple vendors, some legit, some just hoping sympathy would taste like cinnamon. In New York City alone, thousands of people sold apples on street corners. At one point, you couldn't walk 3 feet without someone offering you Granny Smiths, like it was fruit-based currency. Then you had the miracle cure men, traveling salesmen with mysterious bottles labeled tonic, elixir, or Grandma Hattie's all-purpose lung reviver. Most of it was sugar, alcohol, or something that smelled like a raccoon's regret. But desperate people paid, hoping to cure arthritis, poverty, and possibly their marriage. Bonus points if you sold it from a wagon while shouting Bible verses. If you were very lucky, you might land a gig as a professional line stander. Someone who stood in food or job lines for wealthier folks, too delicate to do it themselves. Yes, even in the soup line economy, there was an upper class. Just try not to pass out before your number gets called. Or maybe you became a grifter, drifting from town to town, offering your services as a piano tuner, fence painter, pig whisperer, whatever people would pay for before they realized you didn't know what you were doing. If they got suspicious, you were already halfway to the next county on foot. Then there was the art of the rent-a-kid scheme. Some families realized soup kitchens and charity lines gave extra food to folks with children. So naturally, some enterprising folks began to borrow children from friends or neighbors, just long enough to snag an extra ladle of stew or a spare coat. Kids didn't mind. It was like a weird, hunger-fueled playdate with stew at the end. Speaking of food, dumpster diving became an unofficial Olympic sport. You learned which bakeries tossed day-old bread, which butchers might accidentally drop a scrap or two, and which restaurants used their back doors as an unofficial grocery aisle. Resourceful folks carried sacks, baskets, or just impressively large coats with inside pockets to stash their edible loot. But the scams weren't just small-time. Some folks posed as job recruiters or housing agents, collecting application fees or security deposits for jobs and apartments that didn't exist. They set up folding tables, gave you a smile and a handshake, and vanished by sundown with your last 25 cents and a slip of paper that said, "Congratulations, you're hired." Others dabbled in fake charity scams, standing on street corners with donation jars and tragic stories, help the homeless, feed the orphans, buy new socks for Widow Johnson. The jars filled with coins, and then so did their pockets. Then came the hobo scams, part survival, part mischief. A classic, the cigarette switch. You ask for a cigarette, take one from their pack, then deftly swap it with your own crumbled, barely smokable stub. You give it back all smiles, and walk away like a magician of sadness. Or maybe you got into train hustles, hopping rail cars, and selling half-melted chocolate bars, old newspapers, or rare trinkets you found in a junkyard. Some even posed as war veterans or circus escapees to tug at heartstrings and loosen coin purses. And for the truly daring, faked deaths and identity changes. You'd vanish from one town, pop up in another, under a new name, and start fresh. Hopefully before anyone noticed the obituary didn't match your height or spelling. But not all hustles were deceitful. Many were just resourceful, turning burlap sacks into dresses, using soap slivers to make Frankenstein bars, hosting penny auctions where neighbors conspired to help a farmer keep his land by bidding absurdly low and scaring off bank agents. These weren't crimes. They were community-backed rebellions with snacks. In the end, the Great Depression didn't just break people. It forged some into survival artists, scammers, schemers, and scrappy inventors who made something out of nothing, even if that something was technically illegal and smelled suspiciously like expired molasses. But despite the grift and grind, people held on. They helped each other, shared what they had, laughed when they could, and waited for the tide to turn. Let's dig into one of the most overlooked yet powerful parts of the Great Depression, the quiet revolution happening in homes, fields, factories, and picket lines, where women and minorities weren't just surviving, they were changing the very rules of survival. The Great Depression may have looked like it crushed everything in its path, but that's only if you're measuring power in dollars. If you measured it in grit, defiance, and the ability to carry 4 children, 3 jobs, and the emotional weight of an entire family on one set of tired shoulders, then women and minorities were the steel backbone of the era. Let's start with women. The myth says they were all in the kitchen, weeping over empty soup pots. The reality? Many were out working jobs, running households without help, and holding up half the sky while wearing second-hand shoes and an apron made from a flour sack. Before the Depression, women were already entering the workforce in growing numbers. but mostly in what society deemed acceptable jobs: teachers, nurses, secretaries, and factory workers. But as the economic collapse deepened, women's work became indispensable, even if it was resented. A lot of men were unemployed, and suddenly that little paycheck from the textile mill or the lunchroom or the sewing shop was the only thing between the family and starvation, and the backlash came fast. Many people, mostly men, complained that women were taking jobs away from them, despite the fact that women were often paid half as much for the same work, or pushed into jobs men didn't even want. Laws were passed in some states barring families from having both a husband and wife working in public jobs, so women who became the sole breadwinners had to fight not just poverty, but policy, prejudice, and endless disapproval from neighbors, who still expected dinner to be ready at 6. Still, they persisted. They worked as laundresses, clerks, phone operators. They took in boarders, mended clothes for pennies, or baked pies to sell from their windowsills. In rural America, women milked cows before dawn, plowed fields after breakfast, and still managed to raise children who didn't forget to brush their teeth. They were tired, tough, and tired of being called fragile. And if you think women just quietly toiled away, think again. They protested. They organized. They joined movements. Labor strikes often included women marching, chanting, and sometimes getting clubbed by police while holding their babies. They campaigned for better wages, safer working conditions, and something radical called dignity. In cities, you might find women organizing rent strikes or demanding school lunch programs. In rural towns, they might be planting victory gardens and keeping entire communities fed. Their resilience wasn't just practical, it was political. They were reshaping what it meant to be strong in public. But the story wouldn't be complete without talking about Black Americans, Latino communities, Asian immigrants, and indigenous people, who didn't just face poverty, they faced poverty with a side of systemic racism. For many black families, the Depression wasn't so much a new disaster as a continuation of centuries-long economic exclusion. Long before 1929, Black Americans had already been locked out of good jobs, fair pay, and equal housing, so when the economy collapsed, they were often the first fired and the last hired. If you were black in the South, you might still be stuck in sharecropping, a fancy name for legal debt slavery that kept entire families trapped in endless cycles of labor for land they didn't own. But again, resistance thrived. Black communities built mutual aid networks, neighbors feeding each other, churches organizing food drives, barbershops becoming political organizing hubs, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a black-led labor union founded by A. Philip Randolph, gained traction in this era, becoming one of the most powerful voices for black labor rights in the country. It wasn't just about wages, it was about visibility, respect, and a fight against the idea that some people were born to suffer. Meanwhile, Latino workers faced deportation, not because they were undocumented, but because the government decided there just wasn't enough to go around. During the 1930s, more than 400,000 people of Mexican descent, including US citizens, were forcibly repatriated to Mexico. Families were rounded up, loaded onto trains, and dropped off in a country some had never even been to. It was economic scapegoating at its worst. But in the face of this cruelty, Latino communities formed their own survival systems, community clinics, food networks, and activist circles that would eventually fuel the labor rights fights of the next generation. In the West, Asian immigrants were often shut out of government aid programs entirely. Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino workers built their own systems. Chinatowns operated like small, self-sufficient cities, pooling resources, sharing childcare, and launching newspaper campaigns to expose injustice. The resilience here wasn't loud, but it was rooted deep in community and tradition, passed down like an heirloom. And on indigenous reservations, things were even more bleak. The government's policies had already stripped Native Americans of land, autonomy, and resources. During the Depression, New Deal programs promised to help, but often did so on the government's terms. Still, many Native communities seized these opportunities to reclaim cultural heritage and resist assimilation, planting the seeds of future political activism that would blossom decades later. Across the board, resilience didn't look like a Hollywood montage of triumph. It looked like sewing the same dress 12 times until it fell apart. It looked like walking miles for work, even when that work paid almost nothing. It looked like standing up, again and again, when everything, including the law, the economy, and your neighbors, told you to sit down and stay quiet. And yet, out of this pain came slow, stubborn progress. Women proved they were essential outside the home. Minorities fought for union representation, political recognition, and civil rights. The pressure cooker of depression didn't destroy them. It steeled them. So the next time you hear about the Great Depression, don't just picture the breadlines and dust bowls. Picture the women marching through them, the black workers organizing strikes, the kids handing out flyers for a better tomorrow. Because even in the darkest decade of the 20th century, people kept fighting, not just to survive, but to change the rules of survival itself. The Great Depression ended, but it didn't vanish. It seeped into the bones of the 20th century and kept echoing long after the stock tickers stopped clicking and the breadlines grew shorter. And while people would eventually go back to work, back to movies, back to dances and dinners and dreams of the suburbs, something fundamental had shifted. The generation that lived through it never forgot what it felt like to go without. If you were a child of the Depression, you might have grown up hoarding rubber bands or reusing wrapping paper for the next 20 years. You might have felt uneasy around waste. Even when your pantry was full, you understood, on a deep, cellular level, that prosperity was fragile. One market crash, one missed paycheck, and it could all fall apart again. Government changed too. The New Deal didn't fix everything, but it gave the idea that maybe, just maybe, the government should help its citizens when things fall apart. Social security was born. Public works projects exploded. The idea of a safety net became more than just a metaphor. It became a real thing, with real nets and real safety, if you were lucky enough to be included in it. Unions grew louder. Civil rights movements gained traction. Women didn't go back to the shadows, and minorities who'd been told to wait their turn began demanding their seat at the table with interest. But the most lasting legacy, that's harder to see. It's not in the museums or the textbooks. It's in the quiet resilience passed down like family silver, scuffed, heavy, and valuable beyond measure. It's in every grandmother who pinches pennies, not because she has to, but because once there was nothing to pinch. It's in every family recipe that came from making something delicious out of a can of beans, half an onion, and a miracle. It's in the jokes people tell to survive hard times, because humor, as it turns out, is one of the cheapest and most effective survival tools ever invented. And it's in you too, even now. You might not be dodging dust storms or trading eggs for shoe repairs, but if you've ever had to stretch a dollar, share a burden, or keep going when you really didn't want to, you've inherited some of that Depression-era spirit. You've carried a piece of the fight, even if you didn't know it. So why wouldn't you last a day in the Great Depression? Because the world was brutal, the days were long, and breakfast might just be a boiled potato and a nervous smile. But also because the people who lived it weren't just strong, they were resourceful, communal, stubborn in the face of hopelessness. They survived not because they wanted to suffer, but because giving up wasn't an option. And that's the real kicker. You wouldn't last a day in the Great Depression, but if you were born into it, you would have found a way, just like they did. But thank God, you don't have to. The Volkswagen Beetle. The Beetle is the only car in history that started in a dictatorship and ended up at Woodstock. That alone deserves a museum exhibit, and maybe a group therapy session. Imagine a car so iconic, so recognizable, that you could sketch it with 3 crayons and a bad attitude and someone would still say, "Oh yeah, that's a Beetle." But what most people don't know is that this lovable, round, bug-eyed little car was originally designed to motorize an empire, a dark one. Its life story starts with an actual dictator, builds speed through global war, and somehow coasts into a tie-dye laced parking lot, blasting the Grateful Dead. Yes, the Volkswagen Beetle has lived many lives, most of them strange, all of them historic. Let's rewind to Germany in the 1930s, a place where politics were terrifying, mustaches were tiny, and highways were suspiciously new. Adolf Hitler had a dream, a terrible one, yes. But among the many branches of his dystopian vision was a very specific, oddly wholesome idea. Every German family should be able to afford a car, like Oprah, but make it fascist. Enter Ferdinand Porsche, Not yet the creator of luxury race cars that would bankrupt your soul, but a clever engineer with a task: design a cheap, simple, durable car for the people. Something that could handle the rough, poorly maintained roads of rural Germany. Something affordable enough for the average worker, but sturdy enough for long drives on the Autobahn. Something that could hold a family of 5 and still have room for the crushing weight of nationalistic propaganda. And he did it. Sort of. What emerged was the Kraft durch Freudewagen, or the Strength Through Joy car, which sounds less like a road trip and more like a mandatory motivational seminar. This car would later become the Volkswagen, literally, the people's car. It had a rear-mounted air-cooled engine, a simple design, and curves so round it looked like it had been designed by a child with a compass. But there was a problem. Hitler's plan involved citizens paying into a savings program to get the car. Except almost nobody ever got one. Instead, their hard-earned money helped fund military production. So congratulations, you've been signed up for a car and accidentally financed a war machine. And when World War II broke out, the people's car became the military's utility vehicle. The Beetle's base was turned into all kinds of wartime Frankensteins, like the Kubelwagen, a kind of German Jeep, and the Schwimmwagen, which not only drove but also floated, because apparently amphibious invasion vehicles were just another box to check on the Beatles' weird resume. By the time Germany lost the war, the Volkswagen factory was bombed, the country was in ruins, and nobody was really thinking about family sedans. But here's where things get strange. After the smoke cleared and the dust settled on a war-torn Germany, the Volkswagen factory looked less like a car production plant and more like the aftermath of a very angry god playing pinball, bombed out, abandoned, and hopelessly stuck in a very dark chapter of history. The factory was a symbol of defeat until a British Army officer named Major Ivan Hurst showed up with a wrench, a plan, and probably a lot of stubbornness. Now, picture this. A British officer wandering into a destroyed German factory full of broken machines, piles of rubble, and oh yeah, thousands of incomplete Beetles. Rather than smashing the whole thing to bits or setting it on fire, which would have been understandable, Hurst saw potential. Because, hey, who doesn't want a reliable, affordable car in the middle of post-war chaos? Under his direction, the factory was restarted, first to make military vehicles for the occupying forces, and then, slowly but surely, to build actual Beetles for civilians. The Allies saw that a functioning car industry could help rebuild Germany's shattered economy and restore some sense of normal life, so they pumped resources into Volkswagen, nudged the factory back to life, and before long those rounded little bugs were rolling off the line again. Meanwhile, the people of Germany needed a symbol of hope, not war. The Beatles' wartime past was quickly buried under a new identity, one of durability, affordability, and quirky charm. And that charm, well, it was undeniable. By the 1950s, the Beetle wasn't just a car, it was a cultural icon spreading worldwide. In the United States, it was the car for young people who didn't want to look like their parents' gas-guzzling, chrome-laden monsters. It was affordable, easy to fix, and small enough to fit into any hippie commune or college parking lot. And then came the 60s and 70s, the era of flower power, peace signs, and a whole lot of tie-dye. Suddenly, the car that had started its life as a Nazi project was the symbol of peace, love, and anti-establishment rebellion. How did that happen? Well, it's complicated, but basically, the Beetle was everywhere. It was reliable enough to get you across the country on a shoestring budget, quirky enough to stand out in a sea of muscle cars, and cheap enough that you could spend your money on records and incense instead of gas. The Beetle became the official vehicle of Woodstock, the moon landing era, and countless road trips filled with bad decisions and even worse hairstyles. It was plastered with stickers that said things like "Make love, not war," and "Question authority," and maybe an angry bumper sticker or two, because even hippies could get annoyed by tailgaters. Yet, despite all the love and irony, the Beetle never lost its practical charm. It was a car built to last, with a quirky engine in the back that purred like a contented cat, or at least a cat that needed a little extra coaxing on cold mornings. Of course, it wasn't perfect. It was slow, noisy, and didn't have the fancy features we now take for granted. The windows could stick, the heater was about as effective as a wet paper towel, and the suspension was a reminder that comfortable was not in the Beatles' vocabulary, but it had character. something that can't be measured in horsepower or torque. And so this strange little car that started as a dictator's dream of motorizing a nation became the emblem of a generation dreaming of something very different: freedom, peace, and maybe a little bit of chaos. As the decades rolled on, the Volkswagen Beetle didn't just stick around, it took over. By the late 1960s, the Beetle had become the world's best-selling car. Yes, that funny little bug-shaped vehicle with a rear engine was outselling giants like Ford and Chevy. It was everywhere. City streets, country roads, college campuses, even in countries where the roads made driving look like an extreme sport. People loved the Beetle for a lot of reasons. It was cheap to buy, cheap to run, and cheap to fix, which, let's face it, made it the perfect car for anyone whose budget was tighter than a hipster's skinny jeans. Plus, its simple design meant you could pop the hood, or rather the trunk in the front, because the engine was in the back, confused yet, and fix most problems with a screwdriver and a prayer. But let's not pretend it was all sunshine and daisies. The Beetle had some personality quirks, like that stubborn heater that turned your winter commute into a game of how long can I survive without turning into an ice cube, or the fact that it was so small that if you sneezed while driving, you might accidentally hit the steering wheel, and good luck trying to fit anything larger than a loaf of bread in that tiny trunk. Still, for millions, the Beetle was freedom on four wheels. It was the first car for young drivers, the trusty steed for small families, and the go-to ride for road trips filled with questionable decisions and fast food stops. It even made a few Hollywood cameos, most famously as Herbie, the lovable racing Beetle with a mind of its own, proving that this car could have a personality bigger than its engine. But like all good things, the Beetle's dominance couldn't last forever. By the late 1970s and 80s, newer cars came along with more power, better safety features, and creature comforts that made the Beetle feel like a relic from a simpler and colder time. Fuel efficiency? Sure. Speed? Not so much. Style? Well, it had character, but let's just say it wasn't winning any beauty contests. Volkswagen tried to keep the Beetle relevant, but the writing was on the wall. People wanted bigger engines, air conditioning that actually worked, and a radio that didn't sound like a tin can full of marbles. The Beetle was retiring gracefully or otherwise. Still, the love for the little bug never died. In 1997, Volkswagen gave the Beetle a modern makeover with the new Beetle. A sleek, retro-inspired model that looked like the Beetle had gone to a hipster bar mitzvah and put on a suit. It was a hit with a whole new generation who loved the nostalgia, but wanted something a bit more, well, normal. And then, in 2011, Volkswagen launched the Beetle's final chapter. The last model rolled off the production line, marking the end of an era that spanned over 70 years. The Beetle's legacy? It's a story of contradictions born in a dark chapter of history, reborn as a symbol of freedom, loved despite its flaws, and remembered as a car that did things its own way. It's the automotive equivalent of that quirky uncle who shows up at family gatherings with wild stories, a questionable sense of fashion, and somehow everyone loves him anyway. So next time you see a Beetle buzzing down the street, remember you're looking at a car that survived dictatorships, wars, cultural revolutions, and the harsh reality of modern traffic. And it did all of it with a smile on its hood and a personality too big to fit under the tiny trunk. The Mini Cooper. Small car, big attitude. If you thought good things don't come in small packages, you clearly haven't met the Mini Cooper. Born in the 1950s, during a time when the world was learning that gas prices could actually hurt, this tiny titan rolled onto the scene with one mission: save fuel, save space, and look cool doing it. And cool it was. So cool, in fact, that British spies, rock stars, and even fashion icons couldn't resist slipping behind the wheel of this pocket-sized powerhouse. It's the car that said, "I might be small, but I'm here to cause some serious mischief." Funny enough, the Mini Cooper was so compact that your luggage often had to ride separately, and rumour has it, the luggage once filed a formal complaint for abandonment. But hey, when you're that stylish and fast, who's complaining? Designed by the legendary Sir Alec Isigonis in response to the 1956 Suez Crisis, which made everyone suddenly very aware of fuel shortages, the Mini was the automotive answer to a world that needed to downsize without losing style or speed. With its transverse engine and front-wheel drive, It wasn't just a clever design, it was revolutionary. The Mini squeezed every inch of interior space possible into its tiny frame. Seats for four, a surprisingly roomy cabin, and enough personality to fill a double-decker bus. It was practical, efficient, and had an attitude that said, "I'm not just a city car, I'm a legend in the making," and legend it became. The Mini Cooper quickly dominated the rally circuits, beating cars twice its size and proving that size really doesn't matter when you have guts, grip, and a lot of British grit. From Monte Carlo to the countryside backroads, this little beast handled it all, often with a cheeky grin on its grille. The Mini Cooper's racing glory is nothing short of legendary, like David taking down Goliath, but with four tiny wheels instead of a sling. This pint-sized speedster shook the automotive world by proving that you don't need a massive engine or a giant frame to leave your competition eating dust. Back in the 1960s, rally racing was dominated by big, powerful beasts roaring through rough terrain. But the Mini Cooper had a secret weapon: nimbleness. It was small, light, and could hug corners tighter than a clingy cousin at a family reunion. Drivers loved it because it was quick on its feet and predictable. No surprises except maybe how fast it could fly over a hill. The car's crowning glory came in the Monte Carlo Rally, one of the toughest and most prestigious races on the calendar. The Mini Cooper won not once, not twice, but 3 times in 1964, 1965, and 1967. Imagine that: a tiny car outpacing rivals with engines twice its size, and drivers with nerves of steel behind the wheel. Those wins weren't just trophies in a cabinet, they changed the game. Suddenly, manufacturers started realizing that smart engineering and lightweight design could beat brute force. The Mini showed the world that clever could be mightier than muscle, and in style too. Off the track, the Mini Cooper quickly became a cultural icon of the swinging 60s. It was the car of choice for trendsetters, musicians, and film stars alike. The Beatles? They rode around in Minis. Peter Sellers? He starred as the bumbling Inspector Clouseau in the Pink Panther series, zooming about in his trusty Mini. It was everywhere, a symbol of youthful rebellion, British cool, and a little cheeky mischief. It was so beloved that it became the official car of the mod subculture. Sharp suits, sharp looks, and the sharpest ride in town. The Mini was small but loud in personality, turning heads on every street corner, and making even the most mundane errands feel like a scene from a movie. Even today, the Mini Cooper carries that legacy forward. It's a reminder that sometimes the best things come in small packages, and that a little car with a big heart can leave a lasting impression on the world. As the decades rolled by, the Mini Cooper refused to just sit quietly in the corner like some old classic stuck in time. Nope. This little car kept evolving, adapting, and proving it was more than just a retro relic. After its blockbuster success in the 60s, the original Mini stuck around for decades, but the world kept changing. By the 1980s and 90s, the Mini was starting to feel a bit like that quirky grandparent who tells the same stories at every family dinner. Charming, yes, but maybe a little out of touch with the latest trends. It was still beloved, but people were starting to look for cars with more horsepower, more comfort, and frankly, more airbags. In 2000, things took a turn when BMW bought the rights to the Mini brand. Now imagine giving that quirky grandparent a complete makeover, new clothes, a fresh haircut, and suddenly, they're the life of the party. BMW reimagined the Mini for the 21st century, keeping all the charm and personality, but adding modern tech, safety features, and enough horsepower to make even the most skeptical speed demons smile. The new Mini was bigger, but not by much, and packed a punch under the hood. It kept its iconic round headlights, compact shape, and cheeky attitude, but suddenly it had things like airbags, anti-lock brakes, and fuel injection. Fancy stuff. It was like your favorite vintage rock band going on a comeback tour, but with a Spotify playlist and LED stage lights. Over the years, the Mini family grew. There were Mini Coopers, Mini John Coopers, Mini convertibles, and even Mini SUVs. Because yes, tiny SUVs are a thing now. Each one had that unmistakable Mini vibe, but tailored to fit new lifestyles, from city slickers zooming through traffic to families squeezing in car seats and groceries. And let's not forget the electric Mini, which showed the car's ability to keep up with the times yet again. The Mini Electric swapped out the gas engine for a battery-powered motor, proving that even a classic can go green without losing its soul. Today, the Mini Cooper remains a beloved icon, part vintage legend, part modern marvel, and all personality. It's proof that small can be mighty, and that a car doesn't need to be giant or flashy to make a big impact on culture and hearts worldwide. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who ruled with wit, will, and a whole lot of red hair. Imagine being the daughter of a king whose marital drama could fill a Netflix series. Oh wait, it did. Elizabeth Tudor was born into a world where survival meant dodging deadly plots, handling temperamental parents, and proving you were more than just the king's leftover. Her dad, Henry VIII, famously had 6 wives. And let's just say, Elizabeth's mum, Anne Boleyn, didn't exactly make it to happily ever after. But Elizabeth grew up sharp, clever, and with a fiery spirit that matched her striking red hair. If you thought modern-day politics was messy, try running a kingdom where everyone's trying to kill you or marry you off to the wrong guy. Elizabeth came to power in 1558, after her sister Mary Ellie's rather grim reign, earning Mary the nickname Bloody Mary, because, well, she wasn't great at religious tolerance. Elizabeth promised a fresh start, a new era of peace, and a reign that would be remembered. Spoiler alert, she delivered. Her reign, lasting 45 years, was filled with intrigue, brilliant diplomacy, and cultural explosion. Think Shakespeare, sea voyages, and secret spies who might as well have been the original James Bonds. She navigated everything from religious upheaval to threats from Spain's mighty Armada, all while famously refusing to marry. She turned Virgin Queen into a brand before brands were even a thing. Her speeches could fire up a room or calm a crisis, and her fashion choices. Let's just say her ruffs were bigger than some kingdoms. Elizabeth's cleverness, charm, and a bit of theatrical flair helped England emerge as a major power on the world stage. Elizabeth's journey to the throne was anything but smooth. Born in 1533, she was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And if you think being a king's kid is glamorous, try being the daughter of a king who famously changed wives like they were fashion accessories. When her mother was executed on charges of treason and adultery, likely exaggerated, but hey, medieval justice had its quirks. Elizabeth went from princess to pariah overnight. She was declared illegitimate, which basically meant she was the royal equivalent of a do not call back on a dating app. Raised away from court under the watchful eye of various tutors and caretakers, she had to learn fast how to navigate a world where loyalty was as unstable as the weather in London. Her sister Mary Affair, a staunch Catholic, inherited the throne first, and didn't exactly welcome Elizabeth with open arms. In fact, Elizabeth was imprisoned for a time on suspicion of supporting Protestant rebellions. Imagine being locked up by your own family. Awkward Thanksgiving dinners would be an understatement. But Elizabeth survived and thrived. She used her education, charm, and quick wit to win supporters and slowly reclaim her status. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth ascended the throne, stepping into a role where every move was scrutinized by nobles, foreign powers, and a population hungry for stability. Once queen, Elizabeth's court was the ultimate stage for politics, romance, and backstabbing, often all happening at once. The court was filled with ambitious nobles trying to win favour, foreign diplomats trying to sniff out England's next move, and poets and playwrights turning court life into art. Elizabeth herself was a master of theatre. She understood the power of image and spectacle. Her famous ruffs were not just fashion statements, but symbols of authority. They were so big and stiff that moving your head too fast could probably give you whiplash. Yet, everyone loved a queen who looked as formidable as she was smart. The court was also a hotbed of romance rumours. Despite her nickname the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth skillfully used marriage talk as a diplomatic tool, keeping suitors and nations guessing. She famously declared that she was married to England, a line that was part genuine devotion, part political genius. Yet beneath the glitter and gowns there was plenty of danger. Court life meant navigating rivalries, secret plots, and the constant threat of betrayal. Spies were everywhere, and a misplaced word could mean imprisonment or worse. Still, Elizabeth's court was also a cultural powerhouse. It fostered the arts and sciences, with figures like William Shakespeare Christopher Marlowe, and Sir Francis Drake shaping the era's spirit of exploration and creativity. If you thought delivering a great speech was just about having a loud voice and some good eye contact, Queen Elizabeth I took it to a whole new level. She knew that sometimes words were the sharpest weapons in her arsenal. One of her most legendary speeches came in 1588, right before the famous showdown with the Spanish Armada. Spain under King Philip II wasn't exactly thrilled with Elizabeth's support for Protestant rebels and English privateers raiding their ships, so they sent their massive fleet to teach England a lesson, or so they thought. With the country facing the threat of invasion, Elizabeth rallied her troops at Tilbury with a speech that could make even the most nervous soldier feel like a hero. She declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." Talk about girl power centuries ahead of its time. She promised to stand and fight alongside her people, not from some distant palace, but right there in the thick of things. The speech was a masterclass in confidence and inspiration, turning fear into fierce loyalty. The Spanish Armada was supposed to be the unbeatable naval force that crushed England once and for all. Imagine hundreds of big, intimidating ships sailing together like a floating fortress. But the Armada ended up being more like a clumsy tourist group lost at sea. The English fleet, smaller and nimbler, harassed the Armada with clever tactics. Think fast boats, fire ships, and hit-and-run attacks that left the Spanish scrambling. And then there was Mother Nature, who apparently didn't get the memo about Spain's invasion plans. After battling the English, the Armada was forced to retreat around Scotland and Ireland, where storms wrecked many ships. It was less a naval defeat, and more a case of Spain versus the Weather Channel. The Armada's failure was a huge boost to English morale and cemented Elizabeth's reputation as a strong, capable leader. Elizabeth's handling of the Armada and her stirring speeches showed the world that she wasn't just a figurehead. She was a savvy politician, a fearless leader, and a queen who knew how to use both words and strategy to protect her kingdom. Her reign ushered in the Elizabethan age, a time of exploration, cultural flourishing, and national pride. From Shakespeare's plays to Drake's voyages around the world, Elizabeth's England was a place bursting with energy and ambition. Queen Elizabeth I was a ruler of iron will and sharp mind, but she also had a flair for the dramatic and some quirks that make her feel surprisingly human, even centuries later. First off, the Queen loved her image. She was obsessed with appearances, famously using a heavy white makeup called ceruse, made of lead. Yes, lead. Imagine putting on your face every day with something that could slowly poison you, just so you could look flawless and intimidating. Beauty was serious business, and Elizabeth's iconic pale face was her royal armor. She also had an impressive collection of elaborate gowns and jewels. Her wardrobe was so enormous that it could probably fill a small castle. Elizabeth used fashion like a tool of power, sending messages with every sparkle and embroidered sleeve. One dress even had eyes and ears sewn into the fabric, symbolizing that she was always watching and listening. Despite the stiff upper lip, Elizabeth had a playful side. She loved wordplay, poetry, and riddles, often challenging courtiers to games of wit. She was known to be charming and engaging in private, a far cry from the icy public persona she sometimes displayed. One famous story involves a black cat. Elizabeth was said to have a beloved black cat named Hector, who supposedly accompanied her everywhere. Given how much superstition surrounded black cats back then, it was a bold pet choice. But Elizabeth was nothing if not bold. She also had a sharp temper and a quick tongue. When a courtier once insulted her, she reportedly replied, "I see no need to flatter a man who lacks sense." Not exactly the kind of comeback you want at a royal banquet. Elizabeth never married, but that didn't mean she wasn't savvy about romance. She skillfully used suitors and marriage proposals as political tools, keeping foreign powers guessing and courting alliance without ever committing. Her love for music and dance was legendary too. Elizabeth was an accomplished musician and dancer, often performing at court. It was said that even in her later years, she could outdance many of her younger courtiers. Talk about ruling with style. History remembers Elizabeth as the formidable Virgin Queen, but like any great monarch, her life became a playground for rumors, legends, and stories that range from the plausible to the downright bizarre. The secret marriage. One of the juiciest rumors was that Elizabeth secretly married Robert Dudley, her longtime favorite and rumored lover. Officially, nothing was ever confirmed, because, well, marrying your close courtier could cause a diplomatic disaster. But gossip at the time suggested the Queen might have slipped a ring on his finger in a hush-hush ceremony. Imagine the court chatter. Did you hear? The Queen's got a secret hubby. It was the 16th century version of a royal Netflix drama, The Phantom Pregnancy. Speaking of mysteries, there were whispers Elizabeth had a phantom pregnancy. That's right. She reportedly believed she was pregnant, even though she wasn't. This led to rumors and speculation about her health and personal life. Whether it was a hopeful delusion or a clever political tactic, it added to the enigmatic aura around her reign. Witchcraft and the Queen. In an era obsessed with witches and magic, Elizabeth herself was sometimes accused of dabbling in sorcery, not because she was spotted casting spells at least, none that made it into the history books, but because her intelligence, wit and political savvy seemed almost supernatural to her enemies. Some thought her trusted advisor, John Dee, was a magician, fueling more gossip about the Queen's supposed magical protection. The face that never ages, Elizabeth's famously pale, flawless face, led to legends that she used secret potions or alchemical concoctions to preserve her youth and beauty. While it was mostly lead makeup, which, fun fact, probably did more harm than good, the rumors added a mystical layer to her image, like the original anti-aging influencer, but with more ruffs and less Instagram. The Virgin Queen. But why? Was Elizabeth really committed to lifelong virginity? Or was it a clever political stance? The rumors flew both ways. Some said she chose to remain single to maintain power. Others whispered darker tales of heartbreak or distrust. Whatever the truth, the myth of the Virgin Queen became central to her identity and England's national mythology. Let's dive into some of the most colourful, fascinating characters who surrounded Queen Elizabeth I, the courtiers, advisors, and rivals, who made her court a swirling stage of intrigue, loyalty, and drama. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the Queen's favourite and forever suspect. If Elizabeth had a court crush, it was Robert Dudley. Handsome, charming, and a bit of a rebel, Dudley was more than just a nobleman. He was the Queen's closest companion for decades. Rumours swirled that their relationship went beyond politics, though they never officially married thanks to some conveniently timed accidents in his family. Dudley was fiercely loyal but also ambitious, making him both an asset and a wild card. His passion for the Queen was legendary. He even led English forces against the Spanish Armada, trying to impress her with his bravery. Their relationship was the royal soap opera of the 16th century, full of tension, longing, and plenty of whispered secrets. Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spy master Elizabeth, didn't just rule with words and charm. She had spies everywhere, and Sir Francis Walsingham was her mastermind. Think of him as the original 16th century James Bond, only with ruffs and no fancy gadgets. Walsingham ran an extensive network of informants and intercepted plots against the Queen, including uncovering the Babington plot to assassinate Elizabeth and put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. Without Walsingham's intelligence work, Elizabeth's reign might have ended much sooner, and not in a good way. Mary, Queen of Scots. The ultimate rival, Elizabeth's cousin Mary, was both a royal headache and a tragic figure, a Catholic queen with a strong claim to the English throne. Mary was the focus of endless plots and conspiracies. Their relationship was complicated, a mix of family ties, political rivalry, and religious conflict. Elizabeth was hesitant to execute Mary for years, but eventually, the threat was too great. Mary's execution in 1587 was a turning point, marking a dark chapter of Elizabeth's reign. Sir Walter Raleigh, the adventurer poet Walter Raleigh, was the quintessential Renaissance man, explorer, poet, courtier, and sometimes a thorn in the Queen's side. He was famous for his attempts to colonize the New World, his swashbuckling adventures, and his love of poetry and drama. Raleigh was bold enough to name a tobacco plant after himself. Well, almost, and he wasn't shy about courting Elizabeth's favour, though sometimes his ambition landed him in hot water. Despite ups and downs, he remained one of the most fascinating figures at court. The Earl of Essex, the tragic rebel Robert Devereux. The Earl of Essex was a young nobleman who rose quickly in Elizabeth's favour, only to crash spectacularly. Charismatic and daring, Essex was the Queen's favourite in her later years, but his impatience and ambition got the better of him. He led a failed rebellion against Elizabeth in 1601, a desperate attempt to seize power. The Queen's response was swift and ruthless. Essex was executed, a dramatic fall from grace that showed Elizabeth still ruled with an iron fist. These characters were more than just courtiers. They were players in a high-stakes drama that shaped the course of English history. Their stories are full of loyalty, betrayal, ambition, and heart, and remind us that behind every powerful ruler stands a colourful cast of characters. As the years went by, Queen Elizabeth I found that ruling a kingdom was a bit like juggling flaming torches while riding a horse and occasionally dodging angry courtiers. The later years of her reign brought new challenges, some more personal, and others that tested her iron will as fiercely as any battlefield. One of the biggest headaches was succession. Elizabeth famously refused to marry or name an heir, turning her throne into the ultimate game of royal musical chairs. Everyone wondered, who's going to take over when the Virgin Queen finally hangs up her ruffs? This uncertainty kept the kingdom on edge, and foreign powers scheming. Meanwhile, aging wasn't exactly a royal picnic. Elizabeth was no stranger to the pressures of time. Her once fiery red hair gradually faded, her health occasionally wobbled, and the weight of ruling a powerful nation started to show. Some court insiders whispered that the Queen's famous sharp wit sometimes gave way to moments of deep loneliness. After all, ruling an empire is a lonely job, especially when you've dodged marriage proposals like a pro. Religious tensions simmered too. England was a patchwork of Catholics and Protestants, and keeping the peace felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of angry bears. Elizabeth's moderate religious policies aimed to calm the waters, but plots to overthrow her and replace her with a Catholic monarch never really stopped. The Babington Plot of 1586, which sought to assassinate Elizabeth and crown Mary Queen of Scots, ended with Mary's execution. A harsh but necessary move that haunted Elizabeth for years. The Queen's later years were also marked by financial strain. The costs of war, exploration, and court extravagance drained the treasury, leaving Elizabeth to balance the books with as much skill as she balanced the crown on her head. She tightened spending, raised taxes, and still managed to keep the show on the road. No small feat when your royal purse is running on fumes. Despite these challenges, Elizabeth remained a symbol of resilience. She adapted, she endured, and she kept England steady through turbulent times. Her legacy wasn't just about conquest or culture. It was about proving that a woman could rule with strength, intelligence, and a flair all her own.